Well, in April 1729, the Dresden-based musician Jan Dismas Zelenka set Psalm 112, Laudate Pueri, as a virtuosic solo motet for tenor with trumpet obbligato. By September 1730 or thereabouts, the Leipzig cantor Johann Sebastian Bach had composed a brilliant, if not even more virtuosic solo cantata, this time for soprano and trumpet, Jauchzet Gott in allen Landen. There can be no doubt that these musicians were well acquainted. When answering questions supplied by Bach's biographer Forkel, Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach stated that Zelenka was among those both admired and known to his father during his last years, adding that Bach also added everything that he valued, everything worthy of esteem in Berlin and Dresden. Over the years, Bach, like Zelenka, acquired a large music library, which included examples of Latin sacred music by Italian composers, among which were items from Dresden. It's quite likely that Zelenka was the primary source of Bach's acquisition of certain works by Caldara, Lotti, Palestrina, and perhaps Pergolesi, because after Kapellmeister Heineken's death, Zelenka, who was now the acting Kapellmeister, would have become the curator of Dresden's Royal Music Collection and keeper of catalogues, as documents from the late 17th century demonstrate. Besides which, Bach's position as a titular composer to the Dresden court, which was awarded in 1736, probably gave him access to Dresden's Royal Music Library. We don't know this, but it's something to consider. Although no evidence has ever been found of a trip to Leipzig by Zelenka, this is a possibility that cannot be ruled out. However, Bach's 5 visits to Dresden between 1717 and 1736, and of course there could have been others, they're well documented. On the basis of the great similarities between Zelenka's brilliant Laudate Pueri and Bach's similarly brilliant Jauchzet Gott in allen Landen, this paper explores the possibility that these two composers either were communicating or else they had met in Dresden at an unknown time after Eastertide in 1727. Zelenka's Laudate Pueri is ZWV 81 is dated simply the 13th of April. The year of composition was almost certainly 1729, which was a date assigned by the late Wolfgang Reich on the basis of the paper used for the autograph score, and that date has been confirmed by Claudia Lubkohl. Psalm 112 was common to the sequences for Vespers for a Confessor as the 4th psalm, and Marian Vespers as the 2nd psalm. Although Vespers for a Confessor was sung throughout the Easter Triduum of Easter Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday, it really can't be said for which of these days Zelenka composed the work, even though Reich believed it was written for Easter Sunday of that year, a time when it was unlikely that the seriously ill Kapellmeister Heineken would be able to undertake his usual musical responsibilities in Dresden's Catholic Court Church. Instead, Zelenka almost certainly directed the music on Easter Sunday 1729, as well as on Easter Monday, when it was usual for him to carry out that task. Sadly, neither the Jesuit Diarium nor the annual letter to Rome, the Jesuits for 1729, reports on the music of the Easter Triduum of that year. But it can be imagined that Zelenka's brilliant setting would require at least one day's preparation by both the solo tenor and the trumpeter. Thus, it can't be said if the date, the 17th of April, was the day of the first performance or the date when the composition was completed. Now, this Laudate Pueri is set in the key of D, which was the key usual in Dresden for compositions requiring royal trumpeters whose instruments were tuned in D. The setting in 3 contrasting movements has the form of an Italian concerto, each movement an aria. The psalm text and lesser doxology are set in the first and second arias, while the final movement is on the word Amen. With its Lombardic snaps, its jaunty rhythms and syncopations, this final movement in triple meter is very much in the Polish style. There once must have been 2 versions of this work. The first, which is published and recorded, is based on the autograph score and on Zelenka's listing into his inventarium. It's scored for solo tenor with soprano written over tenore, trumpet obbligato, violins 1 and 2, viola and organ. The second version, according to Zelenka's entry into his Sami Vari, which is a catalogue compiled soon after or during the early 1730s, it was scored for solo soprano, solo trumpet, violins, viola and organ, with the addition of ripieno oboes. Nevertheless, the 2 music catalogues of Dresden's Catholic Court Church show that the work was for a solo tenor. And by the way, Zelenka made a similar change to his motet Gaude Laetare for Trinity Sunday in 1731, which originally was set for solo tenor, but later was listed in a church catalogue as being for solo soprano. The original solo performers for Laudate Pueri must have been the Dresden court tenor Matteo Lucchini and the principal trumpeter of the Dresden court, Christian Becker. The accompanying players would have been drawn from Dresden's Hofkapelle, led by Pietendel. For the later version, it's probable that the incredibly difficult vocal solo part was given to either of the male sopranos, Ventura Rocchetti, otherwise known as Venturini, or to Giovanni Bindi, both of whom came to Dresden in June 1730 with that group of young singers who'd been selected and trained in Italy at the expense of the Dresden court for the revival of the opera. It's not known for which of these sopranos revised the solo vocal part of Laudate Pueri, but although Rocchetti's name always preceded Bindi's in the lists of musicians published in court calendars, it was Bindi, not Rocchetti, who had an upper range and tessitura capable of singing Zelenka's revised version of Laudate Pueri, whose autograph score has many evidences of Zelenka's revisions. For example, DV appears on the violin line as a later addition, which was a signal to the copyists of the parts that ripieno oboes were to drop out at that point. And additional dynamics appear, including piano, mezzo piano, moderato, and forte, which are early indications of the development of the instrumental and dynamic vocal dynamic shading, which is seen in Zelenka's scores of the 1730s. Moreover, at the end of the first and final movements, the words cadenza and cadenza ad libitum are added to the solo vocal line. An interesting question concerns the manner in which Zelenka might have adjusted the tenor part for soprano, a question that can't be answered at present because the 16 parts that once accompanied the score of Laudate Pueri have been missing from Dresden since World War II. Finally, as far as I know, no one has yet attempted the challenge of revising for publication and recording Zelenka's later soprano versions of both Laudate Pueri and of Gaude Laetare, which is an exciting project that I hope somebody will undertake one day. We now need table 3, please. Bach's dazzling festive setting for solo soprano with trumpet obbligato, Jauchzet Gott in allen Landen, presents a series of questions. Whilst probably being the best known of his cantatas, less has been written about it than his other sacred works. The autograph score is undated, but on the original wrapper for the score and parts, and that wrapper Alfred Duer believes was prepared between late in 1729 and 1731. Bach wrote that the cantata was intended for the 15th Sunday post-Trinity. As this Sunday fell on the 17th of September in 1730, the assumption has been made that this was the date of the first performance, if not the date of the cantata's composition. Duhr, however, noted that the text of Jautzet has little, if any, connection with the readings for the 15th Sunday after Trinity. And by the way, it was Duhr who assigned this work to 1730, suggests that Bach might have been adapting an earlier composition. Bach's original cover note in Ogni Tempo means that this setting could be used for any occasion or at any time, which interestingly is reminiscent of Zelenka's note De Tempore, with his undated setting of Psalm 150, Chvalta Boha Selneho, which is a work in the Czech language, whose text is taken from a Bible, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think it might have been banned in the Czech lands during the Counter-Reformation. And presumably that Bible couldn't be used in Dresden's Catholic Court Church, whose Jesuit chaplains came from the province of Bohemia. The scoring for solo soprano with obbligato trumpet, together with an entire movement set to the word Alleluia, is unique among Bach's cantatas. Whereas Alfred Duhr finds resemblances to Italian masters such as Alessandro Scarlatti, Bach's setting, and Zelenka's Laudate Puri also, bear strong likeness to Johann Joseph Fuchs's pre-1716 motet in C for the Resurrection, Plaudite Sonat Tuba, which is scored for solo tenor, obbligato trumpet, strings, and continuo. This work of 5 movements has a joyous finale on the word Alleluia. Robin Lever also advises that the final Alleluia movement of Bach's cantata BWV 51 has a parallel in his earlier settings of Luther's Easter hymn Christ lag in Todesbanden BWV 4, which also includes Alleluia at the end of each stanza. And of course, it was not at all unusual for Alleluia movements to be sung during the Easter Triduum, and especially on Easter Sunday. The identity of the musicians that Bach had in mind composed Jautzet is puzzling. Whilst it's been assumed that the solo trumpeter was the Leipzig musician Gottfried Reicher, questions surround the identity of the soprano capable of meeting what John Eliot Gardner describes as the ferocious technical demands required of the soprano in the outer movements. The possibility that this cantata was composed for a Leipzig chorister has been ruled out by Duhr, who cites the suggestion that the work was probably intended for the suggestion that was made that it was intended for the court of Weissenfels, and that suggestion has been discounted. And also the suggestion's been made that this work was meant to be sung by Anna Magdalena Bach. And if so, she must have been a brilliant singer. Closer to the mark, however, is Robert Marshall's supposition, which was published in 1975, that the work was written for Dresden and the solo vocal part was intended for a Dresden singer. Marshall named 2 possibilities: the mezzo-soprano Faustina Bordoni-Hasse, who arrived in Dresden in 1731, or, and this is much more likely, the castrato soprano Giovanni Bindi, whose range extended at least to C above the treble stave, which is the highest note required of the soprano in Jautzet. Marshall suggested that Bach might have heard Bindi during the 3 months between Bindi's mid-June arrival in Dresden and the presumed date of the cantata. Clearly, Bindi made a great impact. In the 19th century, Moritz Fürstenau reported that this singer became the darling of Dresden. Crown Prince Friedrich of Prussia, who in June 1730 heard Bindi singing in a now lost cantata by Ristori, later attempted to lure Bindi to Berlin because, as Frederick wrote in 1742, Bindi's voice charmed him. Bach's cantata and Zelenka's Vesper Psalm share many characteristics. They have the same instrumental scoring. The introductory ritornello opens with a fanfare-like motif based upon notes from the harmonic series of the natural trumpet. Both make huge technical demands of the vocal soloist, and each is spectacularly theatrical, especially their respective finales, each of which is set on one word. Are these similarities coincidental? While it's known that Bach visited Dresden in 1725, I wonder if it's possible that his Entwurf, which was presented to the Leipzig Town Council in August 1730, hints that Bach had visited Dresden more recently when he wrote, "One only need go to Dresden to see how the musicians there are paid by His Royal Majesty." Perhaps Bach had first-hand knowledge of a large sum of money that between 1727 and 1730 had become available to the Dresden musicians, as Johannes Augustsson has recently revealed. Besides, had Bach been in Dresden after June 1730, he would have heard Rocchetti or Bindi singing in the Royal Catholic Court Church. In that year, the Dresden Superior reported to Rome that the singing of the usual singers of the court, quote, had shortly before been augmented by the arrival of 3 highly proficient castrati from Venice, who were brought here at great expense to the king. This rare and precious music throughout the whole year attracts non-Catholic listeners, unquote. The castrati were Rocchetti and Bindi, sopranos, and the contralto Domenico Annibali. Had Bach visited Dresden after June 1730 and heard these singers in the Catholic Court Church, then the sacred works of Zelenka in which they might have performed included his Solemn Te Deum of 1724, which was sung following the birth, must have been sung following the birth on the 25th of August of Saxon Prince Franz Xavier, or the Missa Gratias Agimus Tibi, composed for the churching ceremony on the 7th of October of the new mother Maria Josefa. Interestingly, Zelenka also composed a large-scale Salve Regina for solo soprano and instruments dated the 17th of September 1730, which was published in Dresden court calendars that day as being the 16th Sunday post-Trinity in the Gregorian calendar, which is followed by the Catholics. And coincidentally, it's the 15th Sunday post-Trinity in Luther's improved calendar, which is the day designated for Bach's cantata Jauchzet. Moreover, Zelenka composed 2 Vesper Psalms as solo motets, both now missing from Dresden, but one, an extended setting of Laetatis Sum for solo soprano and alto, survives in Prague as a copy. Only Bindi could have sung the solo soprano part, which requires a singer to rise to D above the treble stave. Robert Marshall also noted that Bach's autograph score of cantata BWV 51 is penned with such care that it could pass as a presentation copy, even though, as far as we know, it wasn't presented to anyone. For me, this observation raises really interesting questions. Is it possible that it was Bach's intention to present the work in 1730 or perhaps even 1731 to the King of Poland, August II, at a time when Bach was so in need of protection from his Leipzig adversaries? Is it possible that the work was to be presented with a petition, a precursor perhaps to the Missa of 1733? But if composed for Dresden, then the work's key of C could perhaps present a problem because it wouldn't suit the royal conditions of the court, where the trumpeters used instruments in D. So to conclude, I've observed elsewhere that during the 1720s, Bach and Zelenka or on very similar courses, composing cycles of sacred music to serve their respective confessions. While it's known that Bach was in Dresden in 1725, could 1730 be added as a possibility to the list of visits there? Similarities between Zelenka's Laudate Pueri and Bach's festive Jauchzit are just too great to be ignored. Bindi alone is known to have possessed both the range and dexterity required for certain sacred works of Zelenka and for Bach's cantata BWV 51. Whilst not claiming to offer a firm solution to these unresolved issues which surround this cantata in particular, I hope that speculations might add another dimension to the discussions of the brilliant setting Jauchzit got in London, and that further connections might be revealed in or around 1730 between the Leipzig cantor Bach and Dresden's acting Kapellmeister Zelenka. Thank you.